Welcome to What's Your Next Move, the podcast for peak performers who are making things happen but are running into roadblocks that prevent them from getting what they want. Whether you work for someone else, you're an entrepreneur, thinking about starting your own business, or at a point in your life where you just can't make the move from where you are to where you want to go, you're in the right place. This podcast is all about answering one question: what's your next move? And helping you harness your power so your next move is the one that changes your life. I'm your host and resident provocateur, Arlene Battishill, and I want to know, what's your next move? Hi there, I'm Arlene Battishill, your host and resident provocateur, and I am here today with a really special guest, Sandra Younger, who has gone through an experience that no one would ever want to go through, nor would wish on their worst enemy. And let me give you a little bit of her background before I welcome her to the show. She lost her home, 12 neighbors, and nearly her own life in a catastrophic California wildfire. She's written a best-selling book about the disaster, and it's called The Fire Outside My Window, and has been praised by Amazon reviewers and studied by top-level emergency professionals. After the fire, Sandra discovered that the personal resilience is both a natural strength and a skill set that we can build like a muscle. And combining her own recovery experience with leading academic research, she developed the comeback formula, a 5-step system of powerful common sense practices proven to transform disaster into opportunity and loss into legacy. And she now shares her resilience boosting message as an international speaker, workshop leader, and media guest, has appeared on ABC, CBS, PBS. The whole freaking world has seen her. And she's twice been featured on NBC's Dateline in a number of their specials. And this is such an extraordinary story. And when you have someone who literally is a phoenix rising from the ashes and then turns that experience into something that is really amazing, that is an extraordinary woman. And so, Sandra, I would like to welcome you to our show today. I think we're going to have an amazing conversation. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me. I know you've been busy on the media circuit talking to probably 150 outlets. So I feel very lucky to have you here today. So thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you, Arlene. I appreciate the invitation to tell my story and to share what I learned. And I just appreciate what you do, sharing these comeback stories, I call them, and encouraging other people.
Yeah. And your story is obviously so much in keeping with the topic of my show, which is what's your next move? And the situation you were in necessitated a lot of questions that involved what's your next move. But I want to ask you something first about the fact that you have spoken to the media so much about this experience of, well, you know what, let's start with this. Tell me what happened.
What happened? 14 and a half years ago now, my husband and I had just moved to a beautiful house in a canyon near San Diego. We still live there. Our kids had gone off to college. We were ready for a new chapter, and we found this amazing place. We thought, this is fantastic. We gave it a name, Arlene. It was so special. We called it Terra Nova, which means our new land. And we had just turned 50 years old. We thought, this is a whole new chapter of our lives. 7 months later, we woke up in the middle of what became the biggest wildfire in California history. It has recently been eclipsed for that title. Yeah. But we woke up to the sight of fire outside our windows. We had to grab our animals and a few pictures, jump in the closest car, and drive down a mountain through smoke and flames to escape. In the meantime, of course, our house burned. Over 2,000 homes burned in San Diego that week. But worst of all, 12 of our neighbors who lived fairly close to us in country terms did not make it out of the fire. So when you talk about a bombshell moment that divides your life into before and after, that was my moment.
Mm-hmm. Now, up until this moment in time, you were just going about having your life, because I'm absolutely going to be asking you about the event, but I want to talk about your life prior to this happening. You were a journalist. Is that correct?
Right. I had been a journalist since college. That was my training. I have 2 degrees in journalism. At the time of the fire, I was the editor of a university magazine, and I had been there I don't know, just about 3 years, I guess, and was getting a little ready for a new challenge, but little did I guess what it would be.
Yeah, no
Yeah.
kidding. Now,
So that's what I was doing.
what I find so interesting about that, you were a journalist prior to this event happening. And of course, you've continued to be a journalist throughout your life. That is what you do, it's your calling. But what's interesting to me is how a person is going through this experience of this raging fire and the devastation that they're watching as both the person who's experiencing it and it's affecting her. And then being a journalist, like, how do you square those two things? I mean, what is the experience? It strikes me as you would almost be having like split personalities in the moment because it's you and it's also not you.
That's a really intuitive insight. The way you square it is you realize you have to tell the story. I very quickly realized, people say, when did you decide to do the book? And I say about 20 minutes later, because I realized that I was the storyteller. And that's who we are as journalists. You know, we tell the stories that other people don't have time to go collect and capture. And, you know, I grew up in the South, and we're all storytellers in the South. Arlene, I mean, we just sit out on the front porch and we drink our sweet tea and we tell stories. And it was just in my blood. I mean, I can go back to North Carolina right now and I can find any of a number of cousins. You poke them and the floodgates open with all these crazy stories. So that was who I was, naturally and by training as a journalist. And I had this realization early on that I was the storyteller who had come out of the worst part, where all the casualties were, of, at that time, the worst wildfire anyone could remember.
Right.
And that it was my sacred obligation to tell the story. If I didn't tell the story, this cataclysmic event would fade into history. The lives of my 12 neighbors and a total of 17 people who died in the fire would be forgotten. And the other thing that was compelling me forward was I was in this sort of dead end career-wise, and I had never had the opportunity to be the first-rate investigative journalist I always felt I could be. And I knew this was my shot. I knew there would never be a bigger, better story that literally fell on my head. And if I did not tell this story, I could just quit calling myself a writer or a reporter.
Wow, that's really intense. And in terms of the reporting on the fire that you did, that came immediately thereafter and in the writing of the book, I mean, journalists are supposed to be impartial, especially ones who are in war zones, and you have to keep your emotions in check.
Right.
And there you are as the person most devastated by this, and now reporting on this as a reporter who is supposed to have an impartial perspective on this. You're reporting the facts. Now, how does somebody who is in the deepest part of their emotions in this tragic and profound experience, like, how could you even draw on something in yourself that enabled you to come out of that place and operate as a trained professional journalist in telling this story?
It was a challenge, and I don't think I handled it very well initially because, you know, when people are up against some extreme situation, we tend to default to our sweet spot. You know, I have seen this before, like photographers go out and take photographs, you know, equestrians go take care of their horses. I mean, we go to our comfort zones, and my comfort zone was asking questions. Right. My comfort zone was reporting. And I think that's why I became a journalist to start with is, you know, I was a native Southerner, and I had this insatiable curiosity. My mother used to say, you are just curious about everything. And so after the fire, that curiosity just drove me to want to know, how did this happen? What could have possibly caused this? I mean, this thing just rolled over us, just completely unannounced. We had no warning. And what happened here? And I just had a million questions. And so at first, the reporting was as much a self-imposed assignment, journalistic assignment, I should say it was as much catharsis as it was self-imposed journalistic assignment, that I needed to find out what had happened to me. And I also needed to tell my story. Let's just stop here and recognize how important it is for all of us to tell our stories.
Totally.
That is one of the ways that we begin to heal after any sort of trauma, is to have some place we can tell that story, some safe place where people will listen. Because when we tell our story, it gives us a chance to relive that traumatic experience in a way that we have control over.
Absolutely.
So that was important for me. But I will say, since you brought this up, when I went back and listened to some of the recordings of my earliest interviews, I was just totally embarrassed, because I would be talking to, say, some senior level fire chief who had been in charge of the fire. And I would ask like 2 questions, and then all of a sudden I would hear myself pouring out my story. And I would think, oh my gosh, Sandra, that is so unprofessional. But you know what? I think that it, in a way, served both me and my interviewee, because it put us on level ground. And these people knew that I had a stake in this. And that's why I think I only had, out of probably 150 interviews I did, 2 people turn me down. I think that people realized that I was not just 60 minutes coming in to do an expose. I had a stake in this. I was part of this. I was in some ways a fellow survivor.
Right. And I think, let me know if this actually happened, but my instincts suggest to me that by you, in having those interviews with people, by you then starting to talk about yourself and that this had happened to you and so forth, it actually gives them the vulnerability that you demonstrate in those moments, the honesty. It then gives them permission to access their own, because everybody's doing everything they can to keep their shit together in that moment.
Right. And, part of the work that I do is I help business owners and entrepreneurs tell their own comeback stories, at least the stories that are relevant to their business. Because if we lead with our own story, that does give us both credibility that we've been there and we've overcome a situation, and vulnerability. And that vulnerability does, exactly like you say, give the other person permission to be vulnerable. So it sets up this reciprocal situation. It creates an emotional connection, and that builds trust. And, you might say, as many marketers do, that without trust, people are not going to make that leap from being prospects to clients. Absolutely.
So true. And when you were interviewing, I'm assuming you were interviewing people from the neighborhood, right?
Okay. Well, I interviewed people from all over. I mean, this fire ran all the way across San Diego, and it was for 14 years until 2017, the biggest wildfire in California history. Now we have the Thomas Fire up around Santa Barbara that has taken that dubious distinction. But so I was interviewing a wide variety of people from all these different communities that the fire touched. But the main categories of people I looked for were the survivors, and we'll make a distinction as we continue this conversation, an important distinction between victims and survivors. So I interviewed a lot of the other survivors. I wanted people, when the book came out, to feel that their community had been represented. I didn't want anyone to feel like, well, gee, we lost 300 houses in our community and she didn't even mention us. So I tried to do a representative sampling of all the communities. And I interviewed the families of the victims. There were 17 victims. I interviewed several of those families. And I interviewed a lot of firefighters and law enforcement personnel who were involved in the response. And I interviewed some subject matter experts. Like I interviewed a professor from San Diego State University who literally wrote the book on natural disasters. It's called Natural Disasters. It's a textbook.
So when you were interviewing these people, I'm curious about, number one, how were you managing your own emotions in talking with them, given that you'd been through this experience? But also, when you were talking to them, did you find that you were talking to them and asking them questions in a way that you were searching for answers yourself in terms of your own experience of it?
I'm sure I was, because as I said, it was catharsis for me during those early months and years after the fire. It takes a few years for someone to come back from a life-altering event. And, I would say 2 to 5 years. So in those first 2-3 years, it's all feeling your way into the new normal. And in a sense, we were doing this together. I would talk to survivors, and it was like we were in this club that we hadn't asked to join. And so I think there was some mutual processing going on. And again, my asking them questions enabled them to tell their stories, which is a part of healing. And some people might not have told their stories otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I heard someone, it may have been at the event that we were at, the New Media Summit, where I think, I can't quite remember the exact phrasing of the line, but it was something like, no matter how much pain you're feeling, the healing that someone else can have as a result of you sharing your story is far greater than the pain that you're going to feel in being vulnerable and sharing that story.
Well, yes. And I would add to that, as someone who is a professional story strategist, there are ways to share that story without it being so painful or awkward on either side. And that's an argument. If you have a powerful comeback story at the heart of your work, that is an argument for finding someone who knows how to do that. You don't want to be re-victimizing yourself every time you tell your story, and you don't want to be grossing other people out or causing them to feel so horrified by your experience that they shut you off. So there are appropriate ways to tell these stories, but yes, it's critical that we tell them. And I think part of it is because we think we're the only one, Arlene. I was just reading this story yesterday about loneliness and how loneliness has become so pervasive in society, and how ironic now that we're just swimming in social media all the time. We're connected with everybody every second, and yet people have said that they only have one, maybe no close friends that they feel that they can confide in. So when we tell these stories about, here's what happened to me, and I just was a mess at first. I didn't know what to, people feel validated in their own experience, because we all have some sort of fire in our lives, right? And if we look at just what's going on in the media, we think, oh, we should just bounce back immediately and go buy a new outfit and get a new phone and we'll be fine. And we don't realize it's okay to be devastated by devastating events.
Yeah. And the question that arises from this whole idea of being devastated, it speaks to what you said before, and that is the difference between a survivor and a victim. And can we explore that a little bit for a moment?
Yes. So this was probably the biggest lesson I learned from this fire experience. I was not the first to learn it. The ancient philosophers talked about this thousands of years ago. Viktor Frankl, the great Austrian psychiatrist and author and Holocaust survivor, he talked about it very explicitly in his beautiful book, Man's Search for Meaning. But what I discovered was that even though you may not have any choice in what happens to you, you always, 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 in any given set of circumstances, those are Viktor Frankl's words, have a choice in your response. You get to choose your response. And I like to say you get to choose your story. And here's how I discovered that. So I'm doing all these interviews, right? And most of the people affected by the fire are very positive. They're moving forward. We're rebuilding. We're going to come back. We've got everything that's important to us. We got our our family out. Even Arlene, the families I talked to who had lost loved ones in the fire. And I talked to 2 different families who had each lost 3 loved ones in the fire. So a total of 6 people across 2 families. They were not bitter and angry. They were saying our loved ones would not want us to be sad for the rest of our lives. And they were doing positive things like starting scholarship funds in honor of their loved ones. And one woman who had lost a 16-year-old daughter in the fire, I know, said to me, the fire took so much from us. We're not going to let it have any more. We're not going to let it have our future. We're not going to let it have our joy.
Right.
So that was one response from the people who had lost the most.
Right.
Then I met this man who was the most bitter person I found. He was angry. He was ticked. He felt that the firefighters hadn't done enough for him. He felt that the county was being too onerous in its regulations about rebuilding. And I found out, and he was very proudly calling himself a victim.
Right.
And I found out that he had lost his garage in the fire.
Oh, God.
He had not lost his house. He had not lost any animals. He had not lost any family members. And so there was this disconnect between the level of loss and the response. And that's when I realized there is agency here. There is choice here. And that's when I discovered Viktor Frankl, who said the last of the human freedoms is the freedom to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So I started to wonder, what else could we do to facilitate our own recovery? Are there steps in coming back from adversity? Are there proven steps, no matter what the inciting incident, no matter what the actual adversity? And that's when I started, because, I'm curious. I'm the reporter.
Of course you are.
So I started looking into what studies have been done. And I found this whole body of research. Surprise! People have been working on this for decades. I was late to the table. But this whole body of research within psychology called resilience. And there's even a subset of the resilience literature called post-traumatic growth.
Wow.
So I totally geeked out on all this. And I did, I didn't do PhD level work, but I just read a lot of these studies. And I realized I could boil down all of these practices that had been proven to support recovery. And I could boil them down and put them into one of 5 buckets. And that's when I came up with what I call the comeback formula, which is 5 practices that have been empirically proven to facilitate and speed our recovery from any sort of adversity.
And this is what you do with the people that you coach.
This is what I talk about now. I still help people with their stories if they need that, but that's the story work now is just one part of this bigger subject, which is resilience. And so I love being a speaker. I love leading workshops on this. And of course, I have a special place in my heart and in my calendar for disaster survivors and for emergency professionals who go into these traumatic events over and over and over again, right? Not just once. And unfortunately, there are way, way too many fellow disaster survivors out there. Just look at what we saw in 2017. All of those devastating hurricanes in Houston and Puerto Rico and Florida and all the wildfires in Montana and British Columbia and here in California, now the biggest and also the most deadly wildfires. The wildfires we saw in the wine country took over 40 lives. Yeah,
it's just unbelievable.
5,000 homes. I mean, this is big stuff. And unfortunately, it is not going away.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I live in Los Angeles, and when that fire, the Thomas fire was going on, that was, at least an hour and a half drive from my house in LA. And what we saw in the sky was unbelievable. And it just kept going and going. And, it's so shocking to look at things like this, and then you see it from the air when you're watching the news on TV or on the internet, and they're showing it to you, that it's so inconceivable, and you just can't wrap your head around it as someone who's just watching this. But as someone who's right in the thick of it, how does the brain even comprehend what's happening? And I want to ask you about the survivor versus victim, that the traumatic nature of an event like this for everyone in the Thomas Fire north of LA and in the fire in San Diego. Is there a moment that someone moves from being a victim into a survivor, or is that the place they're starting from and they stay?
That's where the choice comes in. And I do feel that there are some people who are better equipped to make that leap very quickly. I don't want to discount the fact that, emotional challenges can be severe and require some professional support. I always encourage people to get professional support. We did. I think it was really helpful. So some of us are more constitutionally able to make that switch quickly than others. But what I like to point out to people is that it is a choice, and therefore it's an option that some people don't see right away. They don't see that they can look at themselves as a survivor rather than a victim. Because here's why: everybody calls you a victim. You look at the media coverage.
The media.
Wildfire victims, hurricane victims, mudslide victims. That's the word that the media uses. And part of my work as an advocate for disaster survivors and emergency professionals is to get rid of this word. We buried the victims. That is the actually chapter title of one of the chapters in my book. We buried the victims. My neighbors were the victims. My house was a victim, but the rest of us are survivors. And so when does that switch get flipped? I think in some of us almost immediately. When you drive through a curtain of flame, Arlene, into clear night, and you realize you're alive, there is no space to be a victim. There is no space to be a victim. And by the next morning, and everybody is calling us fire victims, I'm thinking, what? I'm alive. I'm alive. Come on.
Yeah, that distinction is really, really huge. And what's interesting is there's a parallel here where I was talking to, I did an interview with Anthony Treyes, who was also at the New Media Summit.
I met him. Isn't he amazing?
Unbelievable. And his story around being an Iraq war veteran suffering from PTSD and the trauma associated with that experience. And we got into a very interesting conversation about language, where people who suffer from PTSD are always put into the category, and addressing PTSD are always put in the category of mental health.
Yes.
As opposed to mental fitness.
Yeah. And or an injury instead of some sort of character flaw.
Exactly. And it's the same thing where we use the words victim and survivor. It's the same thing for, predominantly women who have been part of the Me Too movement, where, the women in Me Too are not victims, they are survivors. The ones that lost their lives were victims. The rest of us who survived are survivors. And so that distinction there, because when you say to someone that they are a victim, you're basically disempowering them.
Exactly.
It is to suggest that they have no power in that situation.
Exactly. They've been conquered. They are diminished. They are at someone else's mercy. Speaking of the Me Too movement, I was cheering for Allie. I can't remember her last name, the Olympic medal winner who stood up to her molester.
Yeah, the doctor.
And said,
right?
Dr. Nasser, and said, we are not victims. We are survivors. And I was just cheering when I saw that video, because that is the essence of it. And you see, that is the starting point for this comeback journey.
Mm-hmm.
So we may, even if we feel like victims to start with, and there are certainly circumstances where that would be, the very, very deep losses, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a child,
Mm-hmm.
There is plenty of reason to feel like you are in a powerless, hopeless situation. And yet we know that eventually the light creeps in, especially if we're open to it.
Yeah.
Especially if we have some little shred of belief that we can come back, if we realize that we are resilient by nature, the light eventually finds a crack, and maybe then we can start to feel hopeful. But that is still just the beginning of this comeback journey. It starts with this victim place, or it starts with this adversity that happens to you, and then you become a survivor. And most survivors go on to become thrivers, because we don't want to I didn't want to just camp out on this ash heap that used to be my house. I wanted to rebuild. If the ship goes down, it's great to be a survivor, but you don't want to just hang out on the life ring for the rest of your life. You want to get out of there, and you want to reboot and rebuild. So then you get to a point of thriving. And then a subset of thrivers, probably a pretty good subset, become what I call givers, because we've learned so much. We have more empathy for people who are going through similar things. So we start to help out, maybe in just informal ways. I remember one time we moved to a new neighborhood, and our neighbor across the street brought us a plate of brownies. And she said, I just wanted to bring you these brownies because when we moved in, nobody brought us anything. That's a giver, right?
That's beautiful.
And then some of the givers, just a few, and only if they're called. Giving is a great place to be, a great place to stay. But some of those givers leverage their loss into a legacy, and they go big. And these are the ones I call the changers. So these are the people like Malala or Nelson Mandela or the Dalai Lama, who have all been through enormous tragedy in their lives. And yet they leveraged that. They used that platform that it gave them to help other people. You can also see that whole change maker's journey as simply from victim to victor.
Absolutely. And what you just laid out in the process of a person going from victim to survivor to thriver to giver to changer, is this something that you talk about in your book, The Fire Outside My Window?
Well, I don't talk about it explicitly in the book. The Fire Outside My Window is a narrative nonfiction. It's a first-person nonfiction account of the fire, but I do lay the groundwork because I talk about the journey back and rebuilding our home. And I have a whole chapter in there on victim versus survivor. That was We Buried the Victims. I have an incident there where I actually had an opportunity to meet the man who set the fire. Our fire was set by a lost hunter who lit a signal fire. And I had a chance to meet him and forgive him, which was also an important part of my healing journey. So it sort of sets it up. But the specifics of this change maker's journey or the changer's journey, the specifics of the comeback formula, I developed later. And I have written a workbook called the Comeback Formula Workbook that is that's available on my website, sandrayounger.com. And that is a very brief guidebook or workbook into these concepts that I wrote for other disaster survivors. So I may be expanding on that, but for now, it's all contained in a brief workbook.
Well, I think that what you're just describing in this workbook is really remarkable because it's so easy to understand that journey. And certainly for someone going through that journey, it is arduous. And I think that for someone to have a blueprint, like the work,
a map, right?
Or if you, hopefully, I would hope you will go on to expand on it into an actual book. I think for anyone who is at any stage in that process or on that journey, what's helpful to know is there actually is a next stage that you get to. It's kind of like, I don't know how you would frame it, but do you remember the book, What Color is Your Parachute?
Yes, I do. They kept updating it every year.
Yeah. But no, maybe it wasn't that book. It was a book. I think it was Gail Sheehy, who back in the 70s and 80s was writing passages. And I know that she was writing a lot about how different things are for you in different decades and how helpful it was with a framework and a blueprint to help you to understand what's coming next. And for someone who has started as a victim, and anyone who starts as a victim at some point in their life, this has happened against their will. They did not choose this, and they were rendered powerless in that moment. That to feel this sense that there is a journey that is ultimately going to take you to a place of being the changer, which means you are completely in your power, I think is a really strong message to people and something really important to communicate, because this is something that even happens, for most of the people that I work with and communicate with primarily online, is they are entrepreneurs who are on a journey. And this whole thing of victim all the way up to changer actually reflects the life of an entrepreneur.
It so does.
It totally does.
Some people have said that being an entrepreneur is the ultimate personal development experiment.
My God, totally is.
It totally is.
It's so fucking brutal. It's so brutal. But to know that, to understand what comes next and you're on this journey, I feel is really helpful, because it always represents the light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. And that's what everyone needs. That's what hope is all about.
That's what hope is about.
And for you, as you came through that wall of fire, tell me at what moment in time hope showed up for you?
Well, I skipped that part of the story. Hope showed up for me. Hope showed up for me in a very specific way. When we were driving out of the fire, the fire was already at our house. As I backed out of the driveway, we could see this big wall of white light and flame wrapping around our beautiful new Terra Nova. And we headed out. And we had to drive down this little skinny road cut into the side of a mountain, and our neighborhood road to get to the main road out. And just as I got to the most treacherous part of this road, we hit the smoke. Oh, God. And I couldn't see anything. I could not see more than a foot in front of me. Wow. And I'm screaming to my husband, I can't see the road. I was driving because we couldn't find the keys to his car. We found my keys. We jumped into the first car, which was my little coupe, my little Acura coupe. We could have been in his Chevy Suburban. But anyway, we're in my little Acura coupe. He's in the front seat. We get two giant Newfoundland dogs in the back seat and a bird cage with our brainless cockatiel Chelsea shoved in the trunk. And here we are in the smoke, and I'm lost, and I know I'm on the edge of this mountain, and I'm yelling, I can't see the road. And Bob is yelling back, just don't wreck the car. Which meant don't drive off the side of this mountain. Mm-hmm. And at that moment, there's the hope. At that moment, a bobcat jumped out of the brush right to my headlight and dashed off into the smoke. And something in me knew that the bobcat was on the road and I should follow it. So I followed the bobcat, and when I got to the place, it had disappeared into the smoke. Then I could see below me at the bottom of this hill, these two fields of red and a dark place in between. And I realized the red was fire, and everything below us was already on fire. But this dark place had to be the road. And so I steered for this dark place. Now, in the South, we would say there's a sermon in there somewhere. When you steer into the darkness and the darkness becomes your salvation, that's what happened. We had to thread our way between these two lines of fire for about a mile.
Oh, my God.
But the hope came to me in the form of this bobcat. So I tell people, this is how I sign my books, Arlene. When I sign a book, I sign it to Arlene, follow your bobcat.
Oh,
Sandra.
my God.
Because I believe that the bobcat or hope, as you put it, and I love that analogy. The bobcat is the grace that drops into our life, just like the fire, the disaster drops into our life unannounced. The grace is going to be there too. And it drops into our life just when we most need it, perhaps when we least expect it. And our only job is to know it's coming and to follow it when we see it.
Oh my God, that is so magnificent.
You like that?
Oh my God, I love it so much. I mean, it's just, it's the kind of story, it's the moment in a story that is so unbelievable and has so much meaning in it. And the takeaways from it, everything is summed up in that moment where, like, I mean, I love what you just said about when you go right into the darkness and the darkness becomes your salvation.
Yeah.
That, I mean, it's so unbelievable an experience like this and the perspective you had in that moment where, well, let me ask you this. When you were leaving your house and you knew what you were surrounded by and you drove down that mountain road, was there a moment when you thought, oh my God, we are actually going to die?
No, I never thought that. And I don't know why I never thought that, but it never entered my mind. I was thinking about things that, could have led to that. I mean, I was thinking about, I got to stay on this road. We were driving through fire. I was thinking, I got to go as fast as I can because I've got a gas tank hanging under my car. Maybe it's like when you run your finger through a candle. If I keep going fast, it won't burn me. I never thought that, more likely than the gas tank exploding would be the fire sucking the oxygen out of the air and shutting down my engine. Fortunately, I didn't think about that. Fortunately, I didn't think when I did get to the main road and I was I was straddling the center lines because there was fire on either side, and I was still in the smoke. I didn't think that I might hit something head on. My husband thought of all those things, but thankfully, I didn't, because I was just focused on getting out as fast as we could.
Right. And let me ask you something about your relationship with Bob. You probably haven't been asked this before.
Uh-oh.
Nothing to worry about.
Okay.
Well, I think about it, and, for someone who's gone through a traumatic experience like this, typically they go through it alone, and then they have a spouse or they have children, they have family, whatever. And then, they're struggling with the post-traumatic stress disorder that naturally follows from this. But the two of you are going through this at exactly the same time. How did the two of you manage your respective traumas in the context of your relationship?
Well, that was part of the challenge of coming back is managing that. And I think that anyone who goes through a trauma has to deal with that, because even though you experience the same thing, you don't experience the same thing. I was driving, he wasn't. He wished he were driving. He did, he had totally no control, right? And so that was a different experience for him than it was for me being behind the wheel. And it's hard on relationships. You have to find your way into the new normal together. And here's where another avenue of choice comes in. Some people, it brings closer together. Some people, it divides farther apart. Some marriages didn't survive the fire. Right. And you can see this in any kind of trauma. I have a very close friend, and she lost a child. The marriage did not survive that loss. And yet other people have grown closer together. This is another reason I really, truly believe in professional counseling to help you navigate that early stage where you're really trying to sort things out and developing a mindset towards the recovery period.
Right. Wow. This is just unbelievable. And obviously, I have about 453,000 more questions. But if I may, I want to shift to something that you talked about earlier in our conversation. And it's about the recounting of the story, which you have done hundreds of times now since the experience, and how, as you were talking, you can't be reliving the experience every single time, and that you help people to tell their stories in a way where they don't have to, shall we say, go there.
Mm-hmm.
And how does something like that even work?
Well,
I mean, in your own experience, where you've told the story, 150 plus times, how do you, is it the case that the more you tell the story, the less impact it has on you? Or how does that work?
I don't know the mechanics of how it works. I know that in our experience, at first we had to tell the story. I mean, at first people are asking you.
Yeah.
The first 2 days after the fire, my phone did not stop ringing because there were so many people who were calling to see if we were okay, and they all wanted to know what happened. So you're telling this story because people are asking you.
Right.
And then you keep telling the story for a while because you feel compelled to tell it. Like me and interviewing the firefighters, I would ask them 2 questions and then I would tell my story, whether it was professional or not. And then that sort of ebbs away. And then eventually you don't feel the need to tell the story anymore. Mm-hmm. And then eventually you don't even want to tell the story anymore because you've moved on. Mm-hmm. And I think that you can get to a point, though, if the story serves you. And honestly, this is something that I have been struggling with. And it's one reason I didn't mention the Bobcat to begin with, although you reminded me probably I do need to. Why am I still talking about something that happened 15 years ago? God knows there have been a million other worse fires in the meantime. And I see it as an entry point into talking about what I learned from the incident. I don't really want to be telling the fire story for the sake of telling the fire story. At first you don't have another story to tell. Right. But now I do. Now I have the story of what I learned from this incident and what I can share with other people. And you sort of have to tell the story, or at least you sort of have to tell a quick summary of it so that
it's the context.
Yeah, because without that I have no platform. People would say, well, how do you know about resilience? And at first I didn't think that I had enough of a platform. I thought, well, I didn't lose a loved one. And then I realized that because someone heard my story and had lost a loved one and still related to it, I realized, okay, that's just an excuse for you not to be sharing this message. So I think, but back to how you tell a story, I heard another story strategist once say, here's the story you don't want to tell. You don't want to tell the story you're not over yet. You don't want to be on stage and tell your personal story and start crying, because then the audience is focused on you feeling sorry for you and not on your message.
Right.
So again, that's another, I didn't mean to promote strategic story services, but this is another reason to hire a professional story strategist to help you tell the story. And in fact, I have helped people with very painful stories come up with a way to tell it that gets every bit of the power across without re-triggering them.
Right.
So if you're telling a story and it's re-triggering you all the time, then that may not be the healthiest thing for you to be doing. And it may not be serving your audience either. And I noticed this when we were at this event where we met at the New Media Summit, and some people were not able to tell their stories in their pitches where we were sharing our message without getting emotional again. And sometimes that is a sign of authenticity, but sometimes if that has become your message, it's not serving you or your audience.
Absolutely. And I saw that happen as well, where there were moments where what I found really interesting is that there were people who presented themselves throughout that event in certain ways, just in the way they were interacting with people and how they were talking on the stage and And there were certain moments where they came unglued. And I remember one moment in particular, and it was such a painful moment.
It's painful for everyone. You don't want people to be in pain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But more the understanding of the depth of the pain being experienced and feeling that exposed in the moment. And I think, promoting story strategists or not here, I'm all in favor of it, because the thing is when you think about people who have a story that really is a comeback story, whatever it is, there is trauma in that story, and there is trauma that has to be dealt with as part of that story for you to be able to move on through your life, go through your hero's journey onto a point where you do become a changer. And because those stories can have such traumatic elements to them, they can be actually disabling. And how critical it is, and I truly believe this around messaging, that you have to work with someone who has the objectivity where they can listen to your story and figure out how you can tell that story in a way that you don't get derailed. And I know just in my own experience of losing everything 10 years ago, it's now so matter of fact for me to tell that story that I don't really even think about it. But what I do know is I have to have my armor on when I'm telling that story, because and maybe you can speak to this, my loss was 10 years ago, and the aspects of it that were most challenging for me can creep up on me at times.
Right.
It just depends on what's going on. And it doesn't mean I haven't moved beyond it in the same way you've been able to move beyond it. But you cannot go through these experiences and not have moments where that shit bites you in the ass in the present. And how critical it is for you to, the way I think about working with coaches, good ones, is they're there kind of for a checkup. There's a way that you have a checkup with them, like a medical checkup. They're just kind of taking your temperature to see how you're doing and keeping you on track. And I think you have to do that, especially if you're doing really deep and meaningful work where you are trying to help people. Part of how you're helping them is by being vulnerable, but that vulnerability can do you in. And I'm curious in your own hero's journey, if you will, the point at which you were able to move to a place where you were able to just tell your story, not get derailed by it, and to be, living fully in the present in your new normal in a way where you really do have the life that you want to have today.
Yeah, I don't know that there was a certain moment that happened. It's gradual, like anything. Like when you pull a muscle, it hurts like crazy for a while, and then it hurts less, and then and then eventually, you get to a point where you think, is this going to hurt me forever? Sometimes it can last months. And then you get to a point where you realize, it hasn't hurt me for a while and I didn't even notice. And I think it may be like that. So I don't know an exact moment. I think that, again, the recovery period, generally speaking, even a healthy, uncomplicated recovery period is anywhere from 2 to 5 years. I remember at 3 years, when the fire anniversary came around, October 26th was my fire anniversary. At 3 years, it was a beautiful day, and I was driving along in my car here in San Diego thinking, gosh, we've come so far. We've got our house back. And that was a moment when I felt that we'd really gotten back on track. So that was 3 years in, and I do recall that. But then, you're just working through levels of it because it becomes it is your hero's journey. And it's not necessarily something, even though we want to get out of it, I think part of the power of coming back from this is to realize I'm not going to get out of it right away. This is my hero's journey. This is part of why I'm here on this planet. This has lessons. This has blessings. There is fortune in misfortune, just like the bobcat. If we're looking for it, if we know it's there, if we know to act on it when we see it. So just to realize that more importantly than getting it over with right away is to just ride with it. There's a sense in spiritual teachings, there's this concept called the cloud of unknowing, or the dark night of the soul is another way of putting it, where there are times in our lives, Arlene, where we just don't know what the hell's going on.
Right.
We would love to think we're in control. And this doesn't make us a victim, but it just is part of the process. You know, in a pregnancy, for example, that baby is in the dark for 9 months. And you don't know what it's doing in there. You don't necessarily know what it looks like. There's another great analogy about how a lobster, when it's time to shed its shell, has to find a place under a rock because it's going to be vulnerable for a while.
Right.
And then it comes back out with its new shell. And guess what? If it doesn't shed its shell, it can't grow. And I think that's the way we are. So rather than looking, as we all do, and I'm guilty for this, gosh, where is the turning point here? Where is the switch I can flip? When can I get the hell out of here? Sometimes our strongest response is just to say, I'm in the soup for a while. And even though I don't know what's going on, there are forces at work here that if I'm open and willing to use this for my own growth, will take me farther than I know. It's sort of like the wormhole on Star Trek, right? You fall into the wormhole and you end up, you don't know what's going on, and the ship is turning upside down. And of course, everybody's being thrown around the bridge because they never learned to use seatbelts. And then you come out somewhere else, like tens of thousands of light years away. You couldn't have gotten to any other way than through that chaotic experience.
Yeah.
So the layers are deep and deep and deep and deep.
Yeah. It's really interesting when you think about the wormhole. It's like going down that dark mountain road and being
into
born
the darkness.
In the womb. You're on that dark mountain road, and you go into the darkness, and you just have to trust that, you know, salvation is waiting for you, your own personal salvation, not in a religious sense, but that you are going to emerge into something that is what it needs to be as you go forward in your life.
Yeah, even though it may not have been what you would have chosen.
Yeah, exactly. And oftentimes it's better to not have what you would have chosen, because the opportunities that are out there, it's always like when you walk through one door, every other door in the universe closes to you. And, you know, you have an opportunity to walk through any door in life, and you're going to walk through many of them, and you're going to make choices about which ones you walk through. And my feeling is always you're looking for as many opportunities as possible. And the one that you end up with is probably the one that was the right one for you, even like you say, if you didn't choose it. There are lessons in all of that. And so, you know, when we were talking offline earlier, we were going to talk about, okay, you know, are you going to turn all of what you're doing into a podcast, and where you're going next? But that may be for another conversation. But I do want to ask you, normally, as we're coming to the close of our conversation on my show, we're looking at what was your next move in the moment that this event occurred, and how did it change the trajectory of your life? But since we have walked through that today, what I'd like to know is, what's your next move now?
Well, isn't that a good question?
That is where the conversation about the podcast comes in.
That is. You know, I am working on that. I'm a bit in the wormhole on that, because for so long I was focused on finishing the book. You know, and it took me so long. My God, the book came out on the 10-year anniversary of the fire, Arlene, and I had no idea it would take me that long. And of course, I was doing a few other things along the way. I was working for the first 2 years. After that, I kept my job as the magazine editor for a while, and then realized I had to stop. I had to have more time to spend on the book. I had to rebuild a house, so forth and so on. But yeah, it took a long time, and I was focused on that. And then when the book came out 4+ years ago now, I thought, well, now what is my best next move? And I realized that I wanted to shared these lessons I had learned about resilience. Mm-hmm. And so I have been working to do that in various ways, and finally have arrived at a path as a speaker and a workshop leader, and I did write the workbook. So what I'm focused on right now is to share this message. I want to get my workbook into the hands of every disaster survivor. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking for sponsors to do that. I'm looking for people like insurers and perhaps energy companies and maybe churches who have the ability to buy these workbooks at a very nominal cost in bulk, so that everyone who loses a home in a natural disaster gets one. And guess what? That information is not out there now. That is not anything that you get from FEMA or the Red Cross. And yet there it is. It's all been proven. It's all been studied. And I've simplified it into 5 steps. So I think everybody needs to have that. And I am committed to making that happen. And the podcast, I'm looking at starting my own podcast potentially to share comeback stories, because again, we think we're the only ones and we're not. And there's so many amazing comeback stories, not just from natural disasters, but from people who have had all sorts of bombshells drop in their lives, whether it's losing a loved one, whether it's a business reversal. I have a good friend who was incarcerated in state prison for 10 years because when he was a kid, he was running with the wrong crowd. And he came out of that and is now a mayor of his hometown. He's now running for state legislature. Wow. He's helping other people develop, with self-development and success strategies. There's so many great comeback stories that I think are inspiring, and that's what I want to focus on. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to what is my next move.
Well, that's a magnificent next move that's going to open up a whole new chapter for you without a doubt.
I hope so. I'm looking for a bobcat right now.
I was just going to say, just follow your bobcat, baby.
I got to do that. Yep. Looking for him. Beautiful. Let me tell you real quick before we end, the meaning of the bobcat in Native American lore is that something is stalking you. Wow. And the bobcat is there to lead you to safety.
Beautiful. That's
Could
a lesson worth listening to.
More literal? I know.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Well, Sandra, this has been absolutely magnificent. I wish we had more time today. And for all of our listeners, can you share with them where they can find you if they want to know more or learn more about you and what you're doing, and where they might be able to reach you in case they find that the comeback formula, your 5-step system of powerful common sense practices proven to transform disaster into opportunity and loss into legacy, might be of benefit to them?
Right. Well, there are 2 places. One is if our listeners today would like a copy of the comeback formula, those 5 steps, along with what I call the 5-minute resilience workout, which is just some simple practices we can do to implement every one of those steps into our life in about 5 minutes, just a touchstone to remind us. If they would like that information, it's at comebackformula.com.
Beautiful.
Comebackformula.com, and leave me your email address and I will guide you to a download page where you can find that. Beautiful. If you are interested in the book or the workshop, or if you want to get in touch with me, if you'd love to hear this in person in a talk or a workshop, you can find me at sandrayounger.com. So 2 different spots they could go.
That's excellent. Well, it's just been an extraordinary conversation. And I guess the last thing I would ask you is, if you were to say one thing to someone who is going through a really, really challenging time that they might be kind of able to hang their hat on and use as a way of reminding themselves that they will get through this, what would you say to them?
I would say you are stronger than you know. Mm-hmm. Resilience is in your DNA, and you can build it like any other skill set. You can build it like a muscle. But the main thing to know is you are stronger than you know. We don't know what we're capable of until we are faced with the need to do it.
Beautiful. I love that so much. Sandra, thank you so much for being here today. This has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate you sharing it with me and our listeners.
Thank you, Arlene. It's been a joy. You asked such wonderful questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity and hope that my story can inspire others.
Oh, I have no doubt about that. So once again, thank you. Well, everyone, what a magnificent conversation yet again here on What's Your Next Move. And as I always wrap up every episode, I ask you to take a look at where you're at in your life and ask yourself, what's your next move? I'm Arlene Battishill, and I'll be back with another episode. Welcome to What's Your Next Move, the podcast for peak performers who are making things happen but are running into roadblocks that prevent them from getting what they want. Whether you work for someone else, you're an entrepreneur, thinking about starting your own business, or at a point in your life where you just can't make the move from where you are to where you want to go, you're in the right place. This podcast is all about answering one question: what's your next move? And helping you harness your power so your next move is the one that changes your life. I'm your host and resident provocateur, Arlene Battishill, and I want to know, what's your next move?